introductory. Oops. Okay, I see. That was the start note for getting recorded. And now we will start with the first presentation. So Dr. Michal Šimůnek is presenting on Zoom and sharing his screen, I suppose. So he's an assistant professor at the Department of Photography of the Film and TV School at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, FAMU. His research interests include vernacular photography, experimental photography, photographic communities of consumption, and contemporary socio-technical transformations of image-making apparatuses and visual culture. Michal Šimůnek is currently working on the FAMU research project Operational Images and Visual Culture, Media Archaeological Investigations, which is led by Jussi Parikka. And I understand this paper is also part of this research. So I look very much forward now to learn more about buttonless cameras and the machine-made snapshot aesthetic.
Okay, thank you very much, Elke. Hello from Czech Republic, particularly from my son's room, which is, I believe, the calmest place in our house. So hopefully there will be no noise and barking of our dogs and things like that. And I will start immediately because I have exactly 10 pages and I hope to make it in 20 minutes. So today I would like to give you a short report on my latest research project. I am trying to trace the history, technical innovations and transformations of a camera shutter release button and consider how these transformations affect the role of a camera operator, influence photography practices and photography itself. In this regard, I focus mainly on photography practices in everyday life, that is home mode, family, popular, vernacular, or let's say snapshot photography. One part of this more comprehensive project and the key point of my today's paper is to draw attention to what I call the buttonless cameras, which have recently begun to infiltrate everyday photography practices. My paper proceeds in 4 moves. First, I frame photography within the questions of automation and the balance of control and autonomy between human and non-human agents. I also draw attention to the conceptions of operational images and non-human photography, which are essential for my following discussion. Second, I briefly explain in what sense is the shutter release button crucial to the modern conception of photography and particularly the snapshot. Third, I discuss some examples of cameras that have been designed as buttonless, while focusing mainly on the discourses of authenticity, control, and perfectionism in which these cameras are deeply embedded. And fourth, I'll outline the core features of snapshot photography, particularly its aesthetic of imperfection, and speculate on its, let's say, buttonless future. Thus, my line of the argument revolves around oppositions of button-equipped and buttonless cameras, human and non-human control over photography, and perfect and imperfect images. Jump to another slide. Let me start by recalling some thoughts of Wilhelm Flusser, one of the most provocative thinkers on automation and robotization of human affairs and photography. In his book, Towards a Philosophy of Photography, he distinguishes between snappers and photographers and makes the following point. Unlike photographers and chess players, people taking snaps do not look for new moves, for information, for the improbable, but wish to make their functioning simpler and simpler by means of more and more perfect automation. Despite this linking of automation and perfection, Flusser further argues that the progressive improvement of cameras, which are with every new model cheaper, more automatic, and more efficient than earlier models, is based on the specific feedback mechanism by which those taking snaps feed the photographic industry that learns automatically from the actions of those taking snaps. According to Flusser, this post-industrial progress has its own telos. And I'm quoting, apparatuses were invented in order to function automatically, in other words, independently of future human involvement. This is the intention with which they were created, that the human being would be ruled out. The Flusser's observations have been recently recalled when scholars and critics addressed increasing automation and robotization of technical images and visual culture. As a result, our critical vocabulary has been enriched by several conceptions pointing to automatic apparatuses equipped with sensors and fed with algorithms. We are accustomed to talk about images known as mindless, as John Peck mentioned recently, operational, famous Farokhi's conception, invisible, as Trevor Paglen calls images, furious, soft, programmatic, and, for example, non-human, as Joanna Zelenska mentioned also recently. Although one has never been able to control the technical image entirely, the human intentions, craftsmanship, ability to intervene, and human clumsiness, unskillfulness, and the ever-present chance and accidents have always been involved in image processes and operations. However, upper-mentioned conceptions of automation and robotization emphasize the gradual replacement of human agents and labor by machine skills and intelligence. Image devices operated by sensors, algorithmic processing of camera footage, and apparatuses autonomously controlling image operations are claimed to obliterate human operators. As it is argued in contemporary post-photography discourse, the activities of humans are more and more irrelevant to images. However, these conceptions seem to be less valuable outside the military and industrial context upon which they were mainly formulated and developed. When addressing, for example, everyday snaps or family photography practices, one can hardly employ conceptions of, for example, operational images and non-human photography. Family snaps still rather represent than operate. You can read the definitions of Farokhi and Joanna Zelenska and Trevor Paglen. I'm just recalling them and paraphrasing them right now. So family snaps still rather represent than operate. They can hardly fall into the category of non-human photography as Joanna Zelenska defined it. As I will describe later, images produced by buttonless cameras are not created by humans, but they are still of and for humans. My aim is thus to contribute to these debates by proposing a conception of buttonless cameras, that is, cameras which are designed, imagined, and conceived as not being equipped with a shutter release button, or cameras that are at least designed to eliminate the human press the button gesture and replace it with a variety of set and forget operations. When considering some recently introduced cameras designed for everyday and mundane use, mainly for parents and pet owners, we are dealing with autonomous seeing machines, which still see the world for us. It is certainly hard to overestimate the significance of a release button for the conception of photography. Probably only with the exception of cameraless photography, pressing the button is simply a crucial act and moment in the photographic process. I do not have time to give a more detailed account of the development and variations of the shutter release button and other technical solutions of how to control and affect exposure. I only want to stress the fact that the shutter button is in many respects the constitutive element of camera and photography, particularly their snapshot versions. I cannot avoid mentioning one familiar moment in the history of photography, the invention of the push-button shutter release that is associated with the well-known Kodak's "you push the button, we do the rest" revolution. Since Kodak 1880s cameras, the push-button mechanism has become a standard and also a mathematical substitution of taking a photograph. To push or press the button means taking a photograph. The general recognition of the press the button gesture could be illustrated by myriads examples taken from popular culture, manuals and journals for photography enthusiasts that are the most extensive category of photographic literature, have always paid much attention to pressuring the button correctly. The illustration is taken from the Czech Manual of Photographic Practice, written and published in 1953 by Rudolf Skopec. It is a schematic explanation of how to operate the camera and how to avoid common imperfections like unfocused and blurred images, chaotic framing, over and under expositions, and so on. However, the critical is the decisive moment of pushing the button, which demands stillness of the body and hand, calmness of mind, and firmness and quickness of the index finger. Very similar recommendations how to release the shutter are popular still today, mainly in the form of endlessly repeated rules of holding breath, activating the shutter, holding the release button, and finally releasing it. There are really a lot of them. Advertising the camera usually means to show it in action. That is when the camera is firmly held in the hands of its operator. Alberto Vicelli recently published a book holding the camera. He collected some 300 camera advertisements from the analog era of photography and proposed a typology of looking through the viewfinder, framing and holding the camera. However, as you can see, I have several more illustrations. As you can see, holding the camera and framing always implies getting ready to press or even pressing the button. The push button revolution has broader and deeper socio-technical implications, as was recently demonstrated by Rakel Plotník in her excellent Power Button: A History of Pleasure, Panic, and the Politics of Pushing book. Plotník explores the process of the buttonization of society from approximately 1880 to 1925 to examine the concerns of a first generation of, as she calls it, push-button society. Plotník's book importantly demonstrates that the push-button protruding from the interface of the Kodak camera was just one example of the masses of buttons flooding the world since the 18th century. When considering Kodak's "you press the button" phrase, she argues, quoting now, its popularity in a wide variety of contexts indicate how the button served as a symbol of consumption and pleasurable control of use for its users. Kodak cameras appealed to potential consumers by heralding buttons as beacons of simplicity and automaticity. Just press the button and let someone else deal with what happens next. By removing labor from the photography process and by putting the working parts of the camera at a distance from the photographer, Kodak offered a model of digital command that relied on pushing and effects. End of quote. The entanglement of photographic camera into modernity, industrialization, consumer culture, and automatization has been significantly realized through the shutter release button. Buttons express the modern desire to effortlessly, let me say by a trivial touch of a single finger, control machines, environments, and daily mundane activities. Pressing the button is also always an enchanting, magical act. Operations set off by pressing the button are black-boxed from our side, and buttons thus call into action magical, unseen servants concealed in the inside of the machine. As I indicated above, by the buttonless cameras, I mean cameras that are designed, imagined, and conceived as not being equipped with a shutter release button. The family of buttonless cameras is in fact quite large. Let me mention, for example, live logging cameras like Microsoft Memoto, Narrative Clip, SenseCam, OMG Live Autographer, or cameras tracking the eye of a photographer in order to focus on the object on which the eye of the photographer is focused also. But today I will describe just only two illustrative cases. Let me start with one probably rather surprising illustration. Edgar Gomez-Cruz and Eric T. Meyer, in their article Creation and Control in the Photographic Process, iPhones and the Emerging Fifth Moment of Photography, argued that camera phones, particularly iPhone, is the first device that combines all essential elements of photography: the making, processing, editing, showing, and distribution of images. According to them, iPhone thus gives a human operator the power to control photography in its entirety. I can even add that iPhones are the most button-centric cameras. Starting with iPhone 5, users can take the picture using the home button, on-the-screen button, volume buttons. If connecting iPhone to earphones or Bluetooth keyboard, one can take images by pressing volume buttons and using earphones and keyboard as a remote shutter control. However, one recent technological advancement questions Apple marketing slogans, arguing that iPhone empowers photographers to master photography. Starting with last year iPhone 11 and even more enhanced in the new iPhone 12, the iPhone takes images using various data collected by multiple cameras and several sensors. It is called deep fusion photography. To produce a photograph, iPhone takes and combines 9 single images. Crucial is that 4 of these images are taken by the iPhone before one presses the button. Let me quote commentary on this fact given by one of the designers of the camera app, Halid. For a while now, you haven't been the one taking your photos. That's not a slight at you, dear reader. When your finger touches the shutter button to reduce perceived latency, the iPhone grabs a photo it had already taken before you even touch the screen. This is done by starting a sort of rolling buffer of shots as soon as you open the camera app. Once you tap the shutter, the iPhone picks the sharpest shot from the buffer. It saves the shot you, the user unaware of this skullduggery, assumes you have taken. Nope. You merely provided a hint to help the camera pick from the many shots it had taken on its own. In this case of iPhone, pressing the button does not mean to take an image, but instead to sort and select the best one of many already taken. My second example is the Google Clips camera. It was designed mainly for family photography. It is a miniature, hands-free, fully automatic and autonomous AI camera able to recognize and capture memorable family moments occurring within the range of its 130 degrees lens field of view. Following mainly Google's promotional formulas, let me show you. See the bottom side of the box in which is camera packaged, notably the slogan "Look, no hands." Passing the camera from the hands of human operators to machines and AI frees family members from traditional photographic labor. Google argues that without being interrupted by picture taking, one can enjoy everyday family life more spontaneously and authentically. Following these promises, the Google Clips camera could have the potential to change relations between human and non-human operators and transform family photography practices and even family life itself, to make not only an authentic record of our life, but also to make the life itself more authentic or more surveilled. The Google Clips is equipped with a shutter button, in fact. The big button on the front of the camera can be used to take a photo manually. One of the Google Clips designers, Josh Lovejoy, expressed in the Google Design podcast in early 2018 that the initial version would not have a button at all. However, they realized to include the button to bond the relationship between the user and new technology. A button should help to build trust, but it failed. Google Clips camera has not been successful at all. It was announced in October 2017, released for sale in January 2018, discontinued and pulled from the Google Store in October 2019, when Google also announced the end of its support by December 2021. The point is, I think, that Clips is primarily designed to let the camera and Google's algorithms take pictures autonomously. And this operator's obliterating fact could not be camouflaged by the button, which is more or less useless. One of the most frequent comments on social networks and chats under articles reviewing this camera was, "Oh, it's creepy." Google Clips died, but the idea of automatic family photography technology is still strongly present in Google strategies. Just a few months ago, I watched the Google commercial promoting Nest Cam Smart Home 24/7 camera system. The commercial enumerates all wonderful uses and functions of this technology, plus one I did not expect at all. Users are encouraged to use this system for taking family photographs. Google Nest Cam technically operates in a similar way as Google Clips camera. However, there is one crucial difference. Nest Cam is embedded in the discourse of the home security, and thus it is probable that users will not consider this camera system as uncontrollably invading their homes and privacy. It is not difficult to imagine the Nest Cam as a technology that once will autonomously take, edit, sort, and preserve our family snaps, create, disseminate, and display our family albums. It is not exaggerated to foresee family photography as primarily a non-human activity in the near future. The snapshot practices seems to be potentially significantly transformed by buttonless cameras. However, what does it mean for a snapshot itself? What buttonless snapshot will look like in the near future? Due to its long history, abundance, and diversity, the snapshot has never comprised a unified and cohesive photographic genre. Despite this heterogeneity, the snapshot could be defined by its specific aesthetic. It captures and represents everyday life's banalities and is paradoxically defined by the partial loss of control over photography. The snapshot has recently pointed, for example, Clement Cheroux, we show examples, in his excellent book, Photography. Well, I'm sorry I can hear the echo of my voice, but I'm just going to conclude in 1 minute. Clement Cheroux is the domain of chance, accident, and various kinds of flaws and errors. Image noise, blurriness, improper exposures, red eyes, fingers inadvertently placed in front of the lens, severed heads, lens flares, leaky shutters, unintentional double exposures, chemical fluids, and mechanical scratches. Clement Cheroux makes just a sort of typology of these, let's say, imperfections in his book. The snapshot aesthetic is an aesthetic of imperfection. Snapshot photographs have always been disordered, inadvertent, failed, and poor images. From this perspective, it seems that buttonless snapshots are not any more imperfect images. On the contrary, they are non-humanly perfect, at least in my view. When it comes to the iPhone, the stunning perfection of deep fusion photographs, which is so acclaimed by Apple, is evident at first sight. Since iPhone 11 and September 2019 Apple event, Apple's promotional appeals do not talk about photography, but only about computational photography. Algorithmically fusing 9 frames into one photograph results in higher resolutions, the balance of lights and shadows, and stunning depictions of texture details, like the case on this model's sweater and on the following illustrative comparisons of HDR and deep fusion technology. These comparisons sort of flooded internet when the iPhone 11 was released. However, most telling, and I'm going to conclude, most telling is the following illustration. I also include this illustration on my first slide, accompanying Josh Lovejoy's article on Google Design. Josh Lovejoy is the designer of Google Clips. Lovejoy describes how the Google Clips camera was designed and how a human-centered design process could elevate artificial intelligence. However, Google's understanding of human-centered design is, in fact, deeply non-human. Let me say, sort of geometric. It is a stunning example of what Flusser meant by a feedback mechanism, by which those taking snaps feed the photographic industry that learns automatically from the actions of those taking snaps and which obliterate not only human camera operators, but also the imperfect aesthetics of the snapshot. The process of learning algorithms to take memorable photographs was as follows. They began gathering footage from people and trying to answer the question, what makes a memorable moment? Then they needed to train models on what bad photograph looked like. Hence, in front of the camera, quick and shaky movement, blurriness, and all other things just should be, erased from the attention of Google Clips. Lafjay described these images in following words. We used examples like the above to train machine learning models to recognize when the camera was inside a pocket or purse, or when a finger or hand was in front of the lens. While it wasn't immediately intuitive to train models to ignore things, it became a crucial strategic piece in our design over time. And these, to the contrary, these are perfect snaps of real moments of parents, kids, and pets captured by the Google Clips camera. Image perfection seems to disappear together with shutter buttons under a glut of flawless images. Wow. This was my last sentence. Even it doesn't sound like this, but it was.
Well, then, thank you very much, Michal, for your presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Marty Miller. I'm doing my research at Hong Kong Polytechnic into the ontology of found photos, basically. And so today I'm going to be talking about finding the relational image, specifically through found photos. And forgive me, but I do have to start with a lengthy quote. It says, "Photography is so evidently material and social, objective and subjective, that is heterogeneous. It is a complex amalgam of technology, discourse, and practice. Photographic agency is a relational effect that first comes into force when a heterogeneous network of humans and non-humans is in place." So essentially, just to get to the point, I'm basically interested in ways to apply that quote to this kind of experience here on the screen. And I came to this topic because of my past experience doing artwork using found photos over several years in South Korea. And then I sort of tried to apply that to a more, to the Hong Kong context, which I'll talk about soon. But to do so, and please forgive me, Michal, I'm really glad you brought up Flusser earlier, if you're still paying attention. But forgive me if I butcher any of his theory here. But essentially, I'm basically applying ideas of relationality to Willem Flusser's media theory. And Flusser says that basically, what I'm taking from him is that we both have to recognize and navigate abstraction as a historical and techno-social process. And that we can easily argue that the photograph is an abstraction from the world. That's, there's no mystery there. It's a reification of an ultimately unrepresentable experience that makes us feel concrete in our actions. But since the breaking down of photos into computational text, which Flusser's all about, and reformulating them as a JPEG, the photo actually becomes more abstracted, but we don't necessarily realize that. So that creates a certain, what can be called a second order abstraction, an abstraction which presents itself as direct. Whereas Flusser might say something like, technical images tend to signify concepts, but these actually seem to be non-symbolic. So what he's really trying to get to here is that, that this relationship, this change should actually should become perceivable. And if you follow his historical thinking, it basically, we see that we basically have to contend with representational qualities of the image, as well as the medium or the material support that it's housed on, and which enables us to have a relationship with it. So really, when we sort of map this onto general, how to talk about photographic image ontology, we kind of start from, what we can call focus one, which is really, saying that, okay, what we're really focusing on here are the representational qualities of the image without really questioning our relation or its relation to the context of finding. On the other hand, since the development of the pictorial turn and the material turn in the humanities, basically we have to start, talking about sort of how contextually contingent attributes end up impacting this encounter with the photo that we have. And specifically today, I'll be talking about found photos. But first, let's map it to relationality. Basically, we can correlate, these 2 points on the ontological spectrum between weak and strong relationalities. And weak relationality, basically, it acknowledges that the photo is already abstracted from the world. It's easier to objectify it and to say that, okay, any kind of meaning we get from it is basically confined to the edges of its frame. And therefore, when designing for this, because I happen to be in design school at the moment, its use is relatively predictable. It's much more predetermined. On the other hand, strong relationality, its use is really multi-stable. One person's trash is another person's treasure or something. Because it's actually observing how different subjectivities end up impacting how meaning is created through all these other different contingencies. And basically, when situating this within a much larger discussion, we can basically say that the photographic images and the machines which create them basically can be seen as a form of technology that ends up mediating our relationship with the world. But when really zooming in here on found photo ontology, we basically have to start by just saying, okay, well, one person's piece of trash on the street is another person's found photo. It essentially has very strong relational qualities at its core. So here we actually have the first photo that I happened to come across when I moved to Hong Kong. And I think probably when you see this photo, you can be aware of the machine that it's on. You probably know what that is. You can probably be aware of the context that this is within, because that's pretty standardized. You can also be aware of the photo being on a machine in a context, and then therefore potentially be aware of my intentions for showing it to you today. You can also be aware maybe of the people's intention who took it. But that actually gets a little bit complicated when photo number 2, this is actually, I found this on the table just to the right when they were still selling these old iPads that had this sort of fake haptic response, buttons on them. But anyway, we can see that really this one stands in contrast to the previous one because we're not really sure to what degree it was taken intentionally or not. And therefore, when we have to start thinking about found photos, we really have to also pay attention to how attention works in correlation with our gestures and our motivations. Because really found photos sit at the crux of an intentional display here between, on the one hand, an accidental and between an intentional or an accidental or chance discovery. So how to negotiate these will kind of be, at the heart here. Because when we talk about how we perceive our own and other people's intentions in these really situated experiences, we end up extending from the found photo towards, forgive me for calling it now, but what I'm calling it is the found photo experience. This ends up playing out through how we relate to a more object-oriented materiality in the found photo, like the found photo has, for example, this thing is separated from its prior ownership and its authorship is unclear. And it's essentially, W.J.T. Mitchell said at one point, these things end up really hiding something from us always, and we'll never be able to touch it. But, on the other hand, something is shared here between the found photo and this found experience. And that is that it first affords a certain subjective experience of meaning and value creation. They're both part of open systems. They afford perceptions of chance. And really, importantly, they actually afford reflection onto the contingencies that allow them to be. And these include both practices of taking and looking at photos. So really, we're extending about how to frame the found photo here through both the act of looking at and sequencing and making meaning, but then also interacting with and creating inadvertently or intentionally. And therefore, we actually have to kind of bifurcate how we talk about attention. We have to say that, okay, well, when you're looking at photos, you're using more hermeneutic attention here, But when you're taking photos, this is sort of built on the ability to, have a device ready at hand, ready to go, and know how and when to use it necessarily without even thinking. And of course, that's by design. It's part of an operative attention scheme. Because when we move from the found photo to this found experience, we're really moving beyond the artifact itself via those relations, Because we really have to see then how relations work. And then to do that, we actually have to start looking at how do we create some contextual relational codes here? It didn't show up on the Apple. But anyway, I have some text here that basically says that, you have to look both at the bodily context, but then, using more of a Merleau-Ponty phenomenology here, saying that body is both, subject and object to itself, within the world, within the flesh of the world, you could say. But then also that, this is mediated through cultural norms and cultural conceptions about how the body should be used in the act of taking pictures. So I'm going to start then with hoping to problematize this more when we talk about these 4 contexts of finding. And, I kind of started playing with these when I moved to Hong Kong to do my research a couple years ago. And basically, I think these help us to ask different kind of questions about object and context relations, specifically the role of our intention to notice or discover traces. So we can start on the street. Basically here we have a nice shiny white piece of paper. We might come across it and it actually piques our attention. And then if we end up, picking it up and seeing photos on the other side, basically, this context here, it ends up showing that, we can't really be aware of any other intentions that are impacting our ability to notice these. I found these outside the MTR on the way to school one day in Hong Kong. But really, it implies the importance of context because it points to an absence of specific mediations to control our intentions here. The second context is the street market. Now, basically, if you're familiar with Hong Kong, in some street they have a street market and you can find all kinds of interesting junk. So here, I basically, found an old memory card. It's an old Olympus from 2004. And, this photo was on it. But we have to actually negotiate certain intentions in relation to physical material properties here. Because really, not every memory card had a found photo like this. And not every camera had a memory card. So really what we have to look at here is that intention in this site is actually connected to an assembling of objects which are deemed to be of equivalent value. And in this case, that value comes less from the type, but from the certain degree of shininess about, how things work together. Because the seller isn't necessarily aware, we can conclude that, these photos aren't recognized or even valuable to the person who owns it. And in this context of finding, it can actually be more akin to a certain accidental or chance discovery. Which then can afford, subjective meanings from the person who finds it. I actually like this one here. It's my favorite. The third context, basically, this, negotiating intentions actually which impact our acts of noticing gets a bit more nuanced. Specifically because we actually have to leave these physical material concerns behind largely as compared to the second case. In this context, actually, these photos are a bit weakly relational to their surroundings, outside of the device which houses it. So therefore, we actually have to look deeper into the frame. And in doing so, we start to recognize a certain semiotic distinction here at play. Here we can see, actually that this photo, it's being sold by something called Estate Discoveries. And, we can actually code it as something that's a presentation of the already found. It actually has an existing frame of value to it. And in this case, I think it's worth about $20. And so we can see that this platform actually allows us to recognize this photo as more of a metaphor for the found, especially when we compare it to this photo found on the same site. This one was not necessarily branded as a found photo for sale. Instead, its meaning actually comes through showing that this camera is still working. So it's pointing back to that. Or in this case, that the camera for sale was not working properly. Because, ultimately, this site, because it hosts both kinds of photos, it's actually a useful platform to really extrapolate this found experience through a more semiotic stance to noticing practices which may occur in our day-to-day lives. And now the fourth context. Here, operational and hermeneutic attentions can actually be noticed to work together. In it, there's a certain noticing that occurs through both the making and looking at photographic images. And once discovered, actually, these photos can help us question how intentions to notice a photo are really embedded both within the location and the machine itself. But the problem is that these intentions kind of come in the form of certain design scripts that, as already came up in the last presentation, that are actually black boxed. So we can really only look to the intentions within the immediate context that we make photos within. And in this case, this involves looking around at things and sort of subjectively determining to what degree we're asked to interact with them. Ooh, there's a sign. Ooh, there's a screen. Oh, okay, here we go. Here we can actually look and see, in this case, the machine is making its intent to seek our interaction more explicit. And, through it, we can actually infer that that value here is the result of a certain postmodern script, which kind of provokes a certain superficial playfulness. In it, people interact with the machine and produce photos that can sort of move laterally throughout the network once they buy the device or, even before if you're creative. But this movement actually comes at the cost of a certain depth for the user, a certain depth of awareness. And that is that it prevents us from really noticing how value is created from behind the scenes here, especially through these photos, Are these photos expected? If so, how frequently? How are they utilized? And so on. So therefore, because of that, we actually have to look back to how interaction happens here. And we can start by noticing that, this material context, it actually utilizes both, operational and hermeneutic attentions. But still, determining a strong versus weak relationality here is still difficult within this context. For example, we can try to figure this out by guessing, how valuable these photos are to the designers of this experience. And from the previous photos, it's pretty likely tied to the interaction with the material interface itself. But then when we look at the material interface, we actually have to look into the logic of abstraction more deeply. Finally coming back around the Flusser. Specifically, how reification works in this interface. I think doing so actually helps us to encounter a difference in these sort of what Flusser would call the apparatic or reciprocally influential qualities of abstraction. So if we see this photo, we can pretty much see that from the human perspective, its intended use is clear. The photo is really a reification of experience in this context. It's basically a person probably using this iPad to take a picture of a person. And when doing so, they're really having this sort of like essentially unquantifiable experience that concretes them in the world. And then abstracting that in material form, and then basically having the picture exhibit a certain weak relationality as a result. But from the machine perspective here, this abstraction is kind of inverted. Yet it's really strongly relational given its programming and placement in the shop. Because these photos can actually be perceived to have equal value in their archiving through this device's own kind of logic, if you will. These photos show that ultimately the interface here works as an interactive membrane between two competing, yet really contextually situated approaches to abstraction. And in these photos here, you can see that the marks are really noted and cataloged, but meaning making through this abstractive logic is more important than the text's English syntax. So when viewing all these together, we can see that value does not really come from discerning attentions as controlling what we notice. Instead, it comes from noticing how abstractive processes invite our interaction. And this interaction is really the engine for abstraction to work in competing ways of knowing in the world. You can see that, it basically cannot really be separated from the material context that intentions play out and the frame that we're operating from today. And these intentions play out by showing how material network relations work, specifically by tying the making of photos to the finding of photos. And this shop shows how intimately tied such photos are to their context. And actually, this noticing occurs despite our knowing of designerly intentions that help guide us through the first couple contexts here. And then how found photos are valued. And so actually, this leads us back to Flusser, and it's a pretty good quote. It says, "The task of photography criticism should therefore be to identify the way in which human beings are attempting to get a hold over the camera. And on the other hand, the way in which cameras aim to absorb the intentions of human beings within themselves." So the examples show how that can be done through considering how found photos afford a relational way of knowing and how such relations could therefore birth the found photo itself. So when consolidating these back down to our emergent themes, we can basically see that we have to start paying more attention to procedural mediation as being relational, as being more of a bridge or facilitator of movement between both bodily actions and the spatial cultural context. Then the feelings that come from it are essentially more related to the site of finding via strong relationality. Because, we experience this when we question what is really at stake when we notice the unexpected. And ultimately, I feel that, finding the found photo experience as relational really helps us to recognize the potential in experiences like this one on the screen. So these are some references that I use for today's presentation. And this is my email. And if anyone's mildly interested, I would really love to talk to you guys about whatever you got going. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. Thank you, all three speakers. We have again now the possibility to post questions into the chat box. I will also ask in the audience. You can get your questions prepared if you have to our speakers. I think we had a very interesting panel right now, starting with the image taken by the machine without pushing incidentally the button, and then the shared image, which is then coming back into the gallery space on another form, in another material, and then the basically abandoned image, or the image which is not really taken care of. And maybe I should start here looking into the audience and ask if anyone has a question to all the three speakers or one of the speakers. So basically, you're collecting the images from the internet, but I actually wonder, did you consider the copyright? I mean, I'm also, I think that's a question for all three of you, because with the kind of automated camera, the Google camera, which Michal introduced, who actually has the copyright? The one who is carrying it around? Or is it the camera? And also for the shared, publicly distributed selfie, as well as the found image? How is that actually working with it? So I think that's something for you all three to...
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start on that one. I don't have a very direct answer, but I feel like it is through creative practice, that's something to really push on. It's really something to have a conversation around. You know, I spent several years trying to do that in a very extremely visual culture in South Korea. And that was part of my intention for using found photos to begin with, is that they are sort of in this in-between space. And I think that's extended into, like a lot of, questions or misunderstanding or conspiracy theories or whatever you want to call it regarding like who has the copyright to our images once they're distributed within the network, right? And so, if we can find ways to push on that or to point to it, the importance of that, having that, we need to have that conversation. Then I think, in a sense, really like, we're focusing more on the relationship between, ownership, authorship, image creating as, maybe Flusser has a great word for it, as something akin to more of this circularity between, production and consumption. That really, maybe that's where the value in using these kind of images lies. But that's my first take on it.
Yeah, maybe I think that we can address this question from the legal perspective and then from the ethical perspective, if I'm right. And from the legal perspective, it's absolutely complicated. It differs according to different regions, nations, states, and legal systems, and so on and so on. So it's rather a messy task, and I'm not oriented in this. But regarding the ethical issue, at least from my own perspective, I think that a kind of personal approach to images that are available and shared publicly, we still sort of need to at least reference these images anytime we are using them for some other purposes, being it in our articles or in artistic works and so on. And of course, when there are Creative Commons credentials, like this is the case of Flickr images, for example, we definitely should follow this Creative Commons rules. Yeah, but I myself consider ethical part of this issue more important for myself, like always trying to check whose the owner of the image, who produced it, who's depicted on this image. And of course, there is the difference between who took the image and who is depicted on the image, because who's got the right for the image of that is publicly shared? The person who is photographed, or the photographer who's the author of the photograph? Yeah, very good question, not a very complicated answer, definitely.
Yeah, no, I think we're always struggling with this issue in many cases. Actually, really wondering, do we actually look at these images? How little of these images are then really recognized and perceived? And I mean, you showed the example with the iPhone, how many images they are captured, and then we only see the one we push the button, but also for the Google camera. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I believe that most of the images we take with our camera phones and share them online or social networks and so on are created just for now, just for a given particular moment. They are not anymore about that has been, but they are about this is now, mostly. And so in this sense, I believe that most of these images are looked at just in a given particular small piece of time, piece of moment. At a given moment, they are shared and then they are forgotten. But I think it's nothing to be worry about, or nothing to care about, because this is how contemporary visual culture simply works. Let's take the snap of the foodie. I'm just having a cake. Let's share it with friends, and then forget it because it's other. And another aspect is that the banalization of visual culture is increasing very significantly, because we are shooting everything, and not all the images are just worth of preservation for the future. Yeah, if I'm answering your question, or it's just rather my opinion, maybe.
Yeah, no, it was rather looking at your presentations. This is what came to my mind. And actually, I would like also to invite the audience out there, the online audience. Feel free to switch on your microphone. I learned that this is now possible, and you can also just shout out, raise your hand, ask a question. And also here for our live audience, if you... there is a microphone in the hand. Sorry, I was so online. Please.
I'm just jealous of, I see our colleague here with a big coat sitting there. In Hong Kong now, they just had typhoon signal #1. So we're going to have a tropical storm later. So it's refreshing to see that other parts of the world are different. We talked about Instagram. And I wanted to bring up as a reference the case of Richard Prince, that I'm sure you may be familiar with, where in 2015, Richard Prince, American artist, took photographs freely available on Instagram, and he made big, nice prints, and he put it in Gagosian, of all places, and they were selling for about $100,000. And that's when the uproar really started, right? When they were selling for $100,000, people began to care that it is their image there, that only Richard Prince is going to get $50,000, one assumes. So I think that even in the digital age, we need to make a distinction between viewing rights and reproduction rights. And the fact that I put my image on a URL on Instagram, and I say anybody in the world can access that URL and view this image. And if you choose to put a monitor in the gallery pointing to that URL, I think you are not infringing on my rights. But if you choose to reproduce my image, especially if my likeness is still recognizable, I think that free viewing rights are not synonymous with free reproduction rights. I'm happy to hear comments to that point.
So as we can't see you, maybe you can just introduce yourself with a sentence.
My name is Ron Yakir. I'm currently a PhD student at the Academy of Visual Art at HKBU.
Hi. I was wondering, like, you know, in response to that, you know, like, how do you think that holds? I mean, I think that's more applicable when we're used to having different sites for making and taking photos. Essentially, we're still used to thinking that, okay, like the act of taking a photo is really different than the act of looking at a photo. You know, and I wonder, like, you know, if this becomes much more blended in the next 20 years, where we're not actually sure, like, you know, to what degree are we participating in an augmented photo that's being made or that's actually created on our screen while we aim it at something, you know, or, you know, like, I wonder, like, to what degree is our technology here kind of eclipsing this traditional distinction, you know, and then, like, you know, because, yeah, once you commodify, you sell it for $100,000, of course, you know, people are going to care and make a difference. But, like, you know, if we're already doing this, you know, if we have a conceptual frame here, if we're framing what photographic image is in both, you know, the making and the looking at, and it's really difficult to see the difference, how long does that take to filter down into our, you know, like the legal aspects of it, or the, you know, in the art world, if you want to sell it at Basel or something.
I would propose that the notion of ownership in the digital domain would be a very interesting panel for
yes,
for Art Machine 3 or something like that. Yeah. It's a very good point, but I think it's a little bit wider than a few minutes we have here.
Yeah.
But my point is that here is an image which is that I'm responsible for it being, whether it's because I selected it from something a machine did or whether I pressed the button. And I displayed that image in a place which was freely accessible. Now, I would be, as a photographer, I would be very upset to think that means because I have put it on display. And it could be, you know, it could be a chemical print that I made in my darkroom. And then I put it in a gallery wall. And then you took a picture of that and sold it in Gagosian for $100,000, right? The fact that I let you display that, I'm not sure constitutes automatically giving you the right to use that image any way you want it. I mean, I don't have a clear answer. I think it's a very thorny issue. And I don't know if I could add a totally separate comment to the idea of pushing the button. Now, I think it's quite interesting that the Brownie Zero had a button on top. That was the first camera that came out. But the Brownie 2 and later actually had a lever on the side, which is very much within the tradition of camera making in the 19th century that preceded it, which it's a very fascinating subject, and now I'm going to look more into it, but I don't have any actual research to point to. But it seems to me that the design of the camera was a result of the slogan, because this idea of replacing human activity with buttons is very current in the Industrial Revolution. This idea of replacing elevator operators with buttons that you press. So this idea of button is the modern thing that makes life easy is something which I think is more widespread than just the Kodak Brownie. And I think that Mr. Eastman was brilliant in catching that moment. Somebody probably should do a PhD comparing the Brownie Zero and the iPhone, because I think that there's some analogies to be made there between analyzing a target market and industrial design decisions that are not for the convenience of the contraption and the durability of the contraption, but are made to make that device a lot easier to operate and therefore far less intimidating.
Yeah, like I think you could even look at like the Apple Store context as like an evolution of that. To some, you know what I mean? Once we have a different idea of what materiality here, you know.
The idea of the Apple Store is like the Ralph Lauren ads from the 80s.
Oh, I wish I remembered that.
I think. I was around in the 80s, right? I saw the Ralph Lauren ads, sorry. They're still available. But it's this idea of not selling you a product, but selling you a lifestyle, right? So if you have waspy models in Newport summering in their, flannels, if you buy the Ralph Lauren clothes, you too can feel like the wasps in Newport. So I think that the Apple Store, and I think that the woman responsible for the redesign of the Apple Store used to be the director of Coach bags.
No kidding.
So there's some connection there. I may be totally wrong. I'm kind of saying this off the top of my head. So somebody should fact check me before they just accept it. But that's my recollection. So it's the idea of the design of the form does not directly follow the function. The form follows the focus group.
Yeah. And that's why concerns of visual culture and design culture are so intimately linked. Yeah. People don't realize as much.
Sure.
But yeah, you could even get to the point where you conceptualize the Apple Store as an imaging apparatus in and of itself.
Absolutely.
And then I think, what was it? Like at one point, Azalea wrote a really good introduction essay to Emil Lusky's photography book, I think 10 years ago. She was basically saying that, okay, if we conceptualize modern image making practices as being something that multiple actants, communicate within in the same moment, it's accessing the idea of photography that's more akin to like the obscura than this thing where the device itself is separating subject from object. But rather what it's doing is, how can we conceptualize the photography as spatially different, where we're both sharing it and, we're not sure who's photographing whom because we're looking at something happening in real time, imaging practices in real time as photography.
I would even make a tangent between the things that we're talking about now to the Hong Kong practice of dating in the sofa section of the IKEA store. So there's a lot of PhD CSI somewhere buried in there.
That's quite an interesting phenomena because the apartments here are quite small.
Yes.
The first time I went to IKEA on a Sunday, I was really surprised.
Absolutely.
In all the sofa sections were families sitting there together.
And it is unique to Hong
fun.
Kong. Yeah. I've been to other IKEAs around the world, and that's not the case. But
actually, I think when it opened in South Korea, it was the same deal. Oh. But it's mostly people over 70. That's maybe the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're deviating now quite a bit. Would you like to comment on the concept of what we talked about, the Apple Store concept, the image as a...
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that was said. By the way, the mechanisms of how to control exposure of a camera are really various and very heterogeneous. For example, in the 19th century, at the time of Kodak was introduced, a lot of cameras were operated by pulling the string, for example. It was sort of, let's say, a magical way how to take the photograph. But regarding the contemporary move from, let's say, buttonized society to buttonless societies, just consider how many slogans are composed of "look no hands." You can see these advertisements on autonomous cars, cameras, and many other devices. But what is sort of, let's say, interesting is that the discourse supporting buttonless apparatuses is the same as was the discourse supporting the introduction of buttons in the 18th and 19th century. Let's free the people from the labor. let's make them live their authentic life. Let's make the life easier, safer, more perfect, more clear. Like you don't have to touch the toilet. It operates itself absolutely. So it's very healthy and so on and so on. So all these discourses are the same. And they are also, again, ambivalent because in the 19th century, when buttons were introduced, as Rachel Plotnik nicely illustrates, there were a lot of worries about the buttons. Who can press the button? What's going on after pressing the button? There are many disasters with elevators and many other like technical stuff operated by buttons. And the same is true about contemporary, let's say, buttonless apparatuses, because they are very often, and I think they are rightly considered as like apparatuses of surveillance. They are intervening into our privacies, and they are in fact like taking out of us the great part of control over machines and apparatuses. And that's what I try to say, in fact, in my paper, that the marketing appeals are based on the idea that our control is increasing. iPhone let us make better images, and we are like betterly equipped to control the image. But my argument is that rather contrary is true, because we are losing the control, absolutely losing. It's just taken by algorithms and sensors and everything like this. It's not about creating perfect images, but yeah, and the imperfections marks the human part of, let's say, technical images, and it disappears too. Well, I'm not sure if I have commented to everything, but at least like this.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like something you said sparked, I'm just thinking, like, do you think that it's, so is that what's at stake here is the user's perception of control, not necessarily regarding what's mechanically possible, right? And so aren't these design decisions, like in the iPhone and so on, like the whole fake haptic response button between the iPhone 5 SE or the iPhone SE and the 6S, right, is basically saying that, okay, we're going to give you the illusion of, you hit this and this happens, right? So, and so like, to what degree do you think like that still has value? Is it better to be tricked and know it? In this sense, does that still afford the user a certain degree more agency to feel like they're taking the photo at the exact moment they want, even if they don't know what the software is doing, that it's taking 5 pictures before they actually do it, I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, I think it's rather interesting, let's say, discursively, because like consider people are, or users are more and more like ready just to give up the control about their life. Like imagine how many people read the conditions of use when they install apps downloaded from app stores or other sources. No one does read these conditions, and almost no one knows that if they are using Facebook app, their photographs are not there, but they are owned by Facebook if they share them on Facebook site. And it's just written in the conditions and the rules, but no one reads that. And I think that the same comes true when considering, for example, the iPhone, because our feeling, and of course, there is all the history of photography is about ambivalencies. And of course, we are gaining some control because we are able to make perfect images even if we don't know anything about photography. So it could we can have a feeling like that we are mastering something, but at the same time, everything is more and more black boxed. And in this sense, in this Fusserian sense, we are losing control because we don't know what's just going on inside. And we cannot control it, and we cannot intervene in it unless we are artists and we are able to hack the device and so on, or unless we are scientists and so on.
Yes. Yes.
Just on that, I was curious to Michael, because you mentioned, with the buttonless, I guess, device now, people sort of abandon the content. It's just for the moment, for the experience now. But how do you feel about the material that, is abandoned after that moment and it sort of is stored at wherever it goes? Depends on, with iPhone, it might be in a buffer, or there might be other, social media platform that saves it. And how, I guess, this abandoned material could then potentially, be material that's used for machine learning. So it's no longer actually, a matter for us. For us, it's just a short moment where we appreciate it, or that particular person, or the image taker. But I guess the material then is very useful for other purposes that we no longer actually have any control over. And I just was curious to see your view on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that all the images we share on social networks are used for other purposes that instead of our private purposes. They are used to, as you said, to learn machines to make better facial recognition, and our GPS data, our locative data are just commodified and sold to different companies just for marketing or surveillance purposes, and so on and so on. So all the traces we just leave behind us in the digital space, or rather in the hybrid space between physical and digital, have many different purposes and uses by many different actors that have access to these data. And this is, by the way, I'm a sociologist basically, and when, for example, trying to investigate how people use smartphones or particular apps and so on, I'm always struggling with the fact that me as an academic, I have very limited access to the data, contrary to the companies that they own these devices and these applications. And I believe that this sort of gap between academia, scholarship, and industry is still bigger and bigger, because we have less data, and they have more and more data. And definitely, of course, if we have enough money and very generous grant, we can probably buy something, or we can develop our own app or something like this. But it's still, we are just, let's say, always several months or maybe years behind these companies when we are thinking about what's going on online and what users are doing and things like this. And that's sort of unsettling in my view.
I just like that kind of the idea how, the button is, I guess, sort of this, it's sort of, it feels like a safe place. It's kind of, as long as we've got the button, it's still the camera, but technically we moved on, and it's no longer the camera.
No. It's still the camera, of course. And if you get this from my paper, it wasn't meant like this. But I have to say that I was really amazed by the Rachel Plotnik's book Power Button, because I really enjoy when you take some very small piece of our material or discursive word, and then you elaborate on this so deeply. And the button, the small, very small material piece, has such a discursive and political and social impact that I'm just simply amazed by this. And I don't think that camera without a button is not a camera, but it's definitely a different kind of camera, because it's just not operated in this particular moment by the human operator. And our photography practices are rather shifting towards, let's say, sorting, viewing, disseminating images. The act of taking images is probably going to be obsolete in 5-10 years, because no one will have to take images, because machines will take them for us. We can just, and they can of course sort them for us. If you look at the photo library in your iPhone, it's still making galleries and faces and sorting the images automatically and sending me messages like, hey, here's your new gallery from 1 year behind, and you can look, how was your holiday last year or something like this. So it's already happening. We are becoming more and more just passive users.
Yeah, I was also thinking of these whole automated images. Now we have a lot of these animal images shot at night with the motion recognition, and also the smile recognition, which Sony already introduced a long time ago. And the camera only captures the image when the smile is recognized, and all these influences we have with the cameras. But that's another topic. There is another question in the audience.
A comment to the notion of control that we just discussed. I think the genius of George Eastman, which I equate with the genius of, we can also put Edwin Land of Polaroid fame into this list, and Steve Jobs of iPhone fame into this mix, is identifying a whole new segment of the population for a particular commodity that they wanted to sell. Because in 1888, before the Brownie, the Zero came out with you push the button, we do the rest, there's a lot of photographers there, right? But this is the segment of population that was interested in ultimate control. They coated the plate, they put the plate in, they adjusted the focus, they adjusted the exposure, they developed the plate, they printed the plate, and so on and so forth. Ultimate manual control. What George Eastman identified is a huge segment of the population that doesn't care about that. It's not a sense of loss of control. It's a sense of freedom from something that I'm not interested in. And I think that this is the success of Kodak photography. And Kodak photography from very early on had to do with not actually reality, but an imagined reality. And I'm thinking, for example, of the notion of the Kodak Shirley from the 1950s, which is the standard reference image of a white, fair-skinned woman, where all prints in all Kodak labs until a certain point of wokeness were calibrated to. And the analogy of that is the selfie camera on my phone. I don't care whether or not the selfie that I take looks like me. Actually, I'd rather it not, because the criteria for a good selfie would be the selfie that makes me look similar to the influencer that I think is the most beautiful person in the world. And this is why I use the beautifying app or the AI built into my phone that makes everybody look like that ideal, right? Narrows the cheeks, makes the eyes pop out, and smooths the skin. So it has nothing to do with reproducing reality. It has to do with ego gratification, because I'm fooled by my own selfie, right? If I look at this doctored image, somewhere I believe it because I want to believe it. So I'm not interested in accuracy. I'm interested in self-satisfaction.
And the perception of control again, right? Isn't that what it comes down to, you know?
But control to what end, right? Control to what end?
Well, Eastman and Apple shareholders. Easy.
From,
you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. But then again, it's still using our, you know, I mean, I guess maybe, Michal, you probably know Flusser better than I do, you know, but I think, you know, he's basically historicizing how this happened, you know, how, you know, like what primed the ability to, you know, to say, okay, we can use this technology and apply it to people's innate, desire to react and respond to visual representation in general. To move from like a magical image experience, I think he calls it, towards, eventually like the technical image, And so, I think ultimately here, what's at stake also is like our innate desire to look at pictures. Like right now, there's a social distancing picture right in front of me of two people, kind of looking bored and not really touching each other and giving fake high fives, and I can't stop looking at it. Well, I'm not just doing that because I'm nervous, like for some reason, like we're attracted to visual representation, marks on a surface, and then like, how do you utilize that to make profit? Well, if people aren't quite ready for the technology yet, then you have pictorialism or something, you kind of make it look like it's coming out of, expressionism or something, So eventually, you kind of like, and I think one of you guys said it earlier. Yeah, on the iPhone, you still have galleries and stuff. You still have this residue of the analog era that's built into this interaction, But ultimately, where is it going within this 150-year trajectory?
Yeah, I think that's a good question to end with. Where is that going? And quite interesting to think about the future of the buttonless photography in this regard, in the shared images. Possibly we will learn more about this in Art Machines 3. Would be very nice to. If you have any final comment or remark, please go ahead. But apart from that, I think we are coming to an end soon. Michal, any additional comment from your side?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what was said by the previous two speakers, and I sort of agree that when I, as personally, do not want to control something, and I'm bothered by controlling something, I'm absolutely ready to give up this control to machine or whatever. And that's what is behind the genius moves of Eastman and Steve Jobs and so on. Definitely, I agree. But it has at least two consequences in my view. One is that we have to, because almost all the history of photography, at least from the, let's say, artistic perspective, was written from the human-centric perspective. Like, there is a human who creates images, there are great photographers, there are great inventors, and all these mainstream stories. I'm not thinking about Geoffrey Batchen and his conception of vernacular photography at this moment, and things like that. But mainstream history of photography is a human-centric history. It's a history of humans taking images. And now it's turning into other direction, because we have to maybe slowly but surely abandon this human-centric approach and shift to sort of machine or apparatus-centric approach. And just the last comment, the unsuccess of Google Clips camera was, in fact, maybe given. There were a lot of reasons. Like, for example, it operates just only together with the app. And it was possible to install the app only on the most expensive Google and Apple smartphones, like really those top categories. But the most important reason was probably the fact that everyday snappers are not yet ready to give up the control over the button. And it was more or less apparent in the discussions on the social network about the remarks, about the creepiness of Google Clips. And maybe it was just too early to come with Google Clips, but maybe in 10 years it will be welcomed and it will be great commercial success. Okay, stop. I'm just circling.
I would love to continue the conversation with you now over a cup of coffee, but I hope maybe we can follow up online. I don't think I have time to ask you, Ralph, for a final comment, but I think half a minute.
I just want to comment that there's, I think this interesting time has just said that it feels now that an image is no longer just for us, for humans, but there's now, and I guess this dimension that the image might be taken by a machine or automated that is then meant to, again, for a machine process. And the human agency might not be, in certain cases, really be, involved, or there might be not even a step in there. I don't know if I can't think of an example at the moment where that's the case, but I'm just that thought is something that not negative or positive, but I think that's just an interesting thought. Is an image now or in the future for a machine?
Say thank you very much for 3 really interesting presentations and very engaging discussion. And as I say, I would love to continue, but well. And a very big thank to our tech team. I think they did an amazing job in getting us here all online and helping with the questions and the timing. So thank you all, and I hope to see you all again in person or online.